It is one of the hardest working rivers on the planet, a ribbon of water that snakes out of the high Rocky Mountains and winds across the vast deserts of the American West, sustaining tens of millions of people in a land that would otherwise be far too dry to support them. The Colorado River made the modern Southwest possible, transforming an unforgiving desert into a place where great cities and vast farms could flourish, and now, after all it has given, it is running dry. After decades of drought, a warming climate, and demand that has long outstripped supply, the river has shrunk to a shadow of what it once was, its great reservoirs falling to historic and alarming lows. Its once certain future now thrown into serious doubt. And that raises an urgent question, one that hangs over some of the fastest growing and most important cities in the country. What happens to the cities that depend on this river as it continues to decline? This is the story of the Colorado River's crisis, told through 7 great cities that lean on its water. 7 places whose futures are bound up with the fate of a single shrinking river. Before we begin, one honest word. To say a city faces a threat from the river's decline does not mean its taps will suddenly run dry tomorrow. These great cities are not about to vanish. But they do face real and serious challenges as their water supply shrinks, and understanding what those challenges are, and how each city is confronting them, reveals the true shape of the crisis unfolding across the American West. So let us follow the river from its mountain source to the desert cities it sustains, and look honestly at 7 great cities living in the shadow of its decline, each with its own story of dependence, danger, and the determined struggle to secure a future in an age of shrinking water. Quick honest word before we dive in. A lot of people watch these all the way through, love them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a channel like ours going, hitting subscribe. If you are finding this important, take 1 second and subscribe right now. It genuinely matters for us and costs you nothing. And drop your city or state in the comments so we can see who is watching. Alright, let's begin. How cities came to depend on a desert river before we look at the 7 cities. It helps to understand how so many great cities came to depend on a single river running through the desert, because the story of that dependence is the key to understanding the crisis. The Colorado River, for all its importance, is not an especially large river by the standards of the great rivers of the world, and yet an enormous population and vast areas of farmland have been built upon it. This was made possible by an extraordinary system of engineering, of dams that store the river's water in great reservoirs, and of canals and aqueducts that carry that water across mountains and deserts to reach cities far from the river itself. Through this vast infrastructure, the water of the Colorado has been spread across the region, allowing cities to grow in places where the local water could never have supported them. The result is that cities across the Southwest, and even some beyond the river's natural basin, have come to rely on the Colorado for a significant part of their water. Some sit close to the river and draw directly from its reservoirs, while others receive its water through long aqueducts that carry it hundreds of miles. This dependence was built during an era when the river seemed to offer abundant water, when the demands upon it were smaller and the droughts less severe, and the assumption was that the river would always provide. But that assumption has been overturned by the reality of a shrinking river. And now the cities that grew up depending on the Colorado find themselves exposed to its decline. The very engineering that made their growth possible has tied their fate to a river that can no longer reliably provide what they have come to expect, and it is this dependence, built over generations, that now places them at risk. At the heart of this dependence lies a fateful miscalculation made a century ago, when the states of the region first sat down to divide the river's water among themselves. The agreement they reached, the foundational compact that still governs the river today, apportioned the water based on measurements taken during a period that turned out to be unusually wet, so that the amount of water promised on paper was greater than the river actually carries over the long run. In other words, more water was allocated than the river reliably provides, a chronic overcommitment baked into the very framework of the river's management from the beginning. For decades, this discrepancy was masked by the great reservoirs, which had been filled during wetter times and could make up the difference, allowing everyone to take their full share even though the river was not truly producing enough to sustain it. But a reservoir can only cover the gap for so long, and as the drought deepened and the reservoirs were drawn down, the underlying imbalance was exposed. The cities that depend on the river are living, in a sense, with the consequences of that original over-allocation, a promise of water that the river was never truly able to keep. And the crisis they now face is the reckoning that comes when the difference between the promise and the reality can no longer be hidden. The reservoirs that keep the cities alive. To understand what happens to the cities as the river declines, you have to understand the two great reservoirs that stand at the center of the entire system, because it is their rise and fall that most directly determines the fate of the water supply. The Colorado River's flow is captured and stored primarily in two enormous artificial lakes, the largest reservoirs in the country, one upstream and one downstream, which together hold the vast majority of the water in the system. These reservoirs are the buffer, the savings account, that allows the river's water to be delivered reliably even when the river itself runs low in any given year, storing water in wet times to be released in dry ones. Without them, the cities and farms of the region could not depend on the river as they do, because the river's natural flow varies too much from year to year to be relied upon directly. For much of their history, these reservoirs were kept relatively full, a comfortable cushion against uncertainty, but the sustained decline of the river has drawn them down dramatically, until they have fallen to levels far below their capacity, exposing the pale bathtub rings that have become symbols of the crisis. As the reservoirs fall, they approach thresholds that carry grave consequences for the cities and everyone else who depends on them. There is a level at which the great dams can no longer generate the hydroelectric power that helps supply the region, and a lower level still at which water could no longer pass through the dams at all, a catastrophic scenario that would sever the supply to everyone downstream. The decline of the reservoirs toward these thresholds is the clearest measure of the crisis, a countdown that the cities watch with growing concern, because their water security is tied directly to keeping the reservoirs above the levels at which the system begins to fail. The whole drama of the 7 cities and their water plays out against this backdrop of the falling reservoirs, the great stores of water that keep the cities alive and whose decline threatens them all. The priority system that decides who loses first there is another dimension to the crisis that shapes the fate of the cities as much as the physical decline of the water, and that is the intricate system of rights and priorities that governs who gets the river's water, and, crucially, who loses it first when there is not enough to go around. The Colorado is not shared equally or freely, but according to a complex body of law and agreement built up over the past century, a framework that assigns different users different priorities. Some hold senior rights, meaning their claim to the water comes first and is protected until the shortages grow severe, while others hold junior rights, meaning their claim comes later and they are cut first when reductions must be made. This order of priority is not a minor technicality, but a decisive factor in determining which cities are most exposed to the river's decline. The system divides the river among an upper group of states, where the river originates, and a lower group, where much of the Great Desert population lives, and it sets out the obligations for how much water must be delivered downstream. Within this framework, the different cities and states occupy different positions, some more protected and some more exposed. And these positions have enormous consequences as the shortages arrive. A city whose water holds a junior priority may face deep cuts, while a city with senior rights nearby is spared, not because of any difference in need or virtue, but simply because of where each stands in the legal order of the river. Understanding this priority system is essential to understanding what happens to the 7 cities, because their fates are shaped not only by how much water the river carries, but by their place in the line, by the rights they hold and the obligations they are owed. As we look at each city, this hidden architecture of priority will help explain why some face the crisis from a more precarious position than others, and why the burden of the river's decline falls so unevenly across the region. A river that carries more than its size suggests before turning to the cities themselves. It is worth appreciating just how remarkable it is that the Colorado carries the weight it does, because by the measure of sheer volume, it is not one of the world's mighty rivers, and yet it has been made to do the work of one. The Colorado is a river of modest flow compared to the great rivers of the wetter parts of the world, and yet upon its waters rests the life of tens of millions of people, the productivity of some of the nation's most important farmland, and the existence of great cities in the desert. This is a testament to the extraordinary lengths to which the water has been stretched, captured, stored, divided, and delivered with a thoroughness that leaves almost nothing to reach the river's natural end. So completely is the river used that in most years it no longer reaches the sea, its flow entirely consumed before it can complete its ancient journey to the ocean, a striking measure of how fully its waters have been claimed. This intense use is what makes the river so vulnerable to decline, because a river that is fully allocated, with every drop already spoken for, has no slack to absorb a reduction in its flow. When such a river shrinks, there is no surplus to fall back on, no unclaimed water to make up the difference, and so any decline translates directly into shortage for the users who depend on it. The 7 cities live with the consequences of this reality, drawing their water from a river that is used to its very limit and beyond, a river whose every drop is contested and whose decline immediately becomes a crisis for someone. Understanding that the Colorado is a relatively small river made to bear an enormous burden helps to explain why its decline is so consequential, and why the cities that depend on it are so exposed. It is not that the river has failed in some dramatic way, but that it was always carrying more responsibility than its modest flow could safely bear, and now, as that flow diminishes, the gap between what the river can provide and what the region demands has grown into the crisis that threatens the cities in its shadow. Las Vegas, the city most exposed. We begin with Las Vegas, the great desert metropolis of Nevada, because no major city depends on the Colorado River more completely. Las Vegas draws the overwhelming majority of its water from the river, stored in Lake Mead just outside the city, making it almost entirely reliant on this single shrinking source. As Lake Mead has fallen to historic lows, Las Vegas has watched its lifeline dwindle, and the question of how long it can continue has become one of the most pressing in the region. This near-total dependence on one declining reservoir is an extraordinary vulnerability, because the city has little else to fall back on if that source fails. Yet Las Vegas has responded to its exposure with remarkable determination, becoming one of the most aggressive water conservers in the nation. The city recycles nearly all of the water used indoors, returning it to the lake, and it has waged a determined campaign against thirsty decorative grass, tearing out lawns and replacing them with desert landscaping to reduce the water loss to the desert air. Through these efforts, Las Vegas has managed to reduce its overall water use even as its population has grown. Buying itself precious security, it has also built a deep intake and pumping station designed to keep drawing water even if Lake Mead falls to very low levels. What happens to Las Vegas as the river declines, then, is a story of extreme vulnerability met by extraordinary adaptation, a city that has done more than perhaps any other to protect itself. Even as its fundamental dependence on the shrinking river remains its defining challenge. It is worth dwelling on just how paradoxical the Las Vegas story is, because it upends the assumptions many people hold about the city. Las Vegas is imagined as a place of reckless excess, of dancing fountains and endless pools in the middle of the desert. And yet, it has become one of the most disciplined water managers in the entire country, a leader that other cities study. Much of this is because Nevada's overall share of the Colorado River is remarkably small compared to the other states, one of the smallest allocations of all, which means the city has always had to build a great metropolis on a thin ration of water and has been forced to become efficient simply to exist. The famous water features of the Strip, which seem the very picture of waste, actually account for a tiny fraction of the city's water use, and much of the water in them is recycled rather than consumed. The real consumption, as in most cities, comes from ordinary residential use, and above all, from outdoor landscaping, which is why the city's war on decorative grass has been so central to its strategy. What happens to Las Vegas as the river falls will test whether even the most determined conservation can be enough when a city's single source is in decline, and the city's experience is being watched closely, because if a place as exposed as Las Vegas can secure its future through adaptation, it offers hope to every other city facing scarcity, and if it cannot, that too would be a sobering warning. For now, Las Vegas endures, having bought itself time and security through its own efforts, but its fate remains bound, more tightly than that of any other city, to the level of the great reservoir on which it depends. Phoenix, The sprawling giant of the desert, our second city, is Phoenix, the sprawling metropolis at the heart of Arizona. A city that has grown explosively in the desert and that depends heavily on the Colorado River for its water. Phoenix receives Colorado River water through a great canal system that carries it across the state, and this water has been central to the city's remarkable expansion. But Arizona's share of the river holds a junior priority, meaning that when shortages are declared, the state's supply is cut before that of some others, and this places Phoenix in a particularly exposed position as the river declines. The reductions have already begun to bite, falling first on agriculture, but raising questions about the water future of the cities as well. Phoenix does have other resources to draw upon, including other rivers and significant groundwater. And the city has taken steps to manage its water and prepare for shortages. But the sheer scale of the metropolitan area, its continued growth, and its dependence on the vulnerable Colorado River supply make it one of the city's most watched as the crisis unfolds. What happens to Phoenix depends on how deeply the river's cuts eventually reach, on how well the city can lean on its other supplies and its groundwater without depleting them, and on whether its growth can be brought into balance with the water available. Phoenix stands as a symbol of the ambition that built the modern desert Southwest, and also of the reckoning that ambition now faces, a great city that must find a way to sustain itself as the river that helped create it runs low. The junior priority of Arizona's Colorado River water deserves closer attention because it is the single fact that most shapes what happens to Phoenix as the crisis deepens. That junior status was not an accident, but the result of a historic bargain struck decades ago, in which Arizona agreed to subordinate the priority of its Great Canal project to California's rights in order to secure the federal support needed to build the project at all. At the time, in an era that seemed to promise abundance, this may have appeared an acceptable price. But it has become the defining vulnerability of Arizona's water supply now that the shortages have arrived, because it means the canal water that feeds Phoenix is among the first on the entire river to be cut. As the reductions deepen, they have fallen first on the farms that also depend on the canal, forcing fields to be fallowed, but the shadow they cast reaches toward the cities as well. Phoenix has prepared for this in important ways, storing water underground in wetter years, investing in conservation, and developing its other supplies, and these preparations give it real resilience. But the sheer momentum of the metropolitan area, which has been one of the fastest growing in the nation, means that its demand keeps rising even as its most vulnerable supply is threatened. What happens to Phoenix will depend on whether it can bring that growth into balance with a shrinking and uncertain water supply, on how deeply the cuts eventually reach, and on how carefully it can manage its groundwater without repeating the overdrafting of the past. The great desert city faces a defining test, and its response will be watched as a bellwether for the whole region. Here is something I would genuinely love to know, and it takes 10 seconds. Have you ever lived in or visited any of these desert cities, and did you notice the water challenges there? Tell us in the comments, because hearing from people with real experience makes these videos better, and I read every reply. Okay, back to the cities. Tucson, the city that banked its water, the third city, is Tucson, Arizona's second great metropolitan area, which shares in the state's dependence on the Colorado River, but which offers an instructive contrast in how a city can prepare for scarcity. Like Phoenix, Tucson receives Colorado River water through the state's Great Canal system, and it too is exposed to the junior priority cuts that fall on Arizona as the river declines. But Tucson has followed a distinctive path in managing its water, one that has given it a measure of resilience that some other cities lack. Rather than using all of its Colorado River water immediately, the city has for years directed much of it into the ground, storing it in the aquifer beneath the region to build up a reserve for the future. This practice of banking water underground has left Tucson with significant stored reserves, a buffer that it can draw upon in times of shortage, and it reflects a far-sighted approach to the reality of a variable and shrinking supply. Tucson has also long been a leader in water conservation, having reduced its per-person water use substantially over the years. What happens to Tucson as the river declines is therefore shaped by this preparation, by the reserves it has stored and the conservation it has practiced, which give it more room to weather the cuts than it would otherwise have. Tucson's story is a reminder that the fate of a city facing the river's decline depends not only on how exposed it is, but on how wisely it has prepared, and that foresight and careful management can make a real difference in a city's ability to endure the shrinking of its water supply. The contrast between Tucson and its larger neighbor Phoenix is instructive, because both draw from the same junior priority canal and both face the same cuts, yet they have approached the challenge somewhat differently, and Tucson's emphasis on storing water underground has given it a particular kind of security. When a city banks water in the aquifer, it is in effect saving for a dry future, putting away water in the good years so that it can be drawn upon when the surface supply is cut, and this stored reserve acts as a cushion that can soften the blow of the river's decline. Tucson's willingness to forgo the immediate use of some of its water in order to store it for later reflects a discipline and a long view that not every city has shown. And it has left the city better positioned than it would otherwise be. The city also sits in a region with a deep awareness of the desert and its limits, an awareness that has shaped a culture of conservation and careful use. What happens to Tucson as the river declines is therefore a somewhat more hopeful story than that of some other cities, not because Tucson has spared the cuts, for it shares fully in Arizona's exposure, but because it has done the patient work of preparing for them. Its experience underscores a theme that runs through the story of all 7 cities, that the decline of the river is a serious challenge, but not necessarily a catastrophe, and that the difference between the two often lies in the choices a city makes long before the crisis arrives at its door. Los Angeles, the distant giant on the aqueduct, our 4th city, carries us west. Beyond the natural basin of the Colorado to Los Angeles, the vast metropolis of Southern California that receives a portion of its water from the river through one of the great aqueducts of the West. Los Angeles and the surrounding region draw Colorado River water across hundreds of miles of desert, a remarkable feat of engineering that has helped supply one of the largest urban areas in the country. But the Colorado is only one of several sources that Los Angeles relies upon, for the city also draws water from distant mountains to the north and from local sources. And this diversity gives it more resilience than cities that depend on the river alone. Still, the decline of the Colorado is a serious matter for Los Angeles, because the river's water is an important part of the supply for the broader region, and its reduction adds to the pressures on a metropolitan area that has always had to import much of its water from afar. Southern California holds a relatively strong position in the priority system of the river, which offers some protection, but the sheer scale of the region's needs means that any reduction in a major source is significant. What happens to Los Angeles as the river declines is cushioned by its many sources and its priority. But the city still faces the challenge of sustaining an enormous population with water supplies that are all, in various ways, under strain. Los Angeles illustrates how the reach of the Colorado extends far beyond the desert, touching even the great coastal cities, and how the river's decline sends ripples across the entire region that depends on its distant waters. The water situation of Los Angeles is a story of dependence on distant sources stretching back more than a century, for the city long ago outgrew its local supply and reached out across vast distances to bring in the water it needed, from the eastern mountains, from the north of the state, and from the Colorado River to the east. This history of importing water from afar has made Los Angeles a marvel of engineering, but also a city perpetually dependent on supplies it does not control, vulnerable to droughts and declines in faraway places. The decline of the Colorado is thus one thread in a larger tapestry of water anxiety that has always shaped the city, adding to the pressures on its other imported sources, which face their own challenges from drought and environmental limits. Southern California's relatively strong priority on the Colorado offers a meaningful cushion, meaning that in the sharing of the river's shortages, the region is protected until the cuts grow quite severe. But this protection is not unlimited, and the sheer scale of the population that must be supplied means that even a well-protected share can fall short of the enormous need. The region has responded with major investments in conservation, in recycling water, in capturing stormwater, and in reducing its reliance on any single source, recognizing that its long-term security depends on using less and diversifying more. What happens to Los Angeles as the river declines will be shaped by the success of these efforts and by the fate of all its distant sources together. a reminder that even the greatest of cities, far from the desert, lives with the consequences of the West's water crisis. Quick pause, because this matters and deserves to be seen. If you are getting value from this, tap the like button. It really does help the video reach more people. And if you have family or friends in any of these cities, share this with them. Because it is genuinely important to understand what is happening to the water they depend on. One like, one share to someone you care about, and let's keep going. San Diego, the coastal city reaching for the sea, the fifth city, is San Diego, the great coastal city of Southern California, which has depended heavily on imported Colorado River water and which has responded to the crisis by reaching, quite literally, for the sea. San Diego has long relied on water brought from afar, including a significant share from the Colorado River, and this dependence on distant and vulnerable supplies has been a defining challenge for the city. Recognizing its exposure, San Diego has worked to diversify its sources and to reduce its reliance on any single supply, pursuing a range of strategies to secure its water future in the face of the river's decline. Among the most notable of these strategies has been the turn toward the ocean through the removal of salt from seawater to create a new drought-proof source of fresh water. This approach, while costly and energy-intensive, offers San Diego a supply that does not depend on the shrinking river or the fickle rains, a hedge against the uncertainty of its imported water. The city has also invested in water recycling, conservation, and securing more reliable rights to the water it does import. What happens to San Diego as the river declines is therefore shaped by this determined effort to diversify, to reduce its dependence on the Colorado, and to build new sources that can withstand the drought. San Diego's story shows how a coastal city with access to the sea has options that inland desert cities lack, and how the pursuit of diverse and drought-resistant supplies can help a city weather the decline of a river it once depended upon. There is a deeper lesson in San Diego's journey, because the city's determination to diversify grew directly out of a painful memory of vulnerability. In a past drought, San Diego found itself dangerously dependent on water imported through a single regional supplier, and when that supply was threatened, the city faced the prospect of severe shortages that could have crippled its economy. That experience became a spur to action, driving San Diego to invest heavily in securing its own more reliable supplies and reducing its dependence on sources it did not control. The turn to desalination, the removal of salt from seawater, was the boldest expression of this determination, giving the city a source of water that does not depend on rain or snow or the level of a distant reservoir. A supply as reliable as the ocean itself. It is not a perfect solution, for it is expensive and demands a great deal of energy, and it cannot by itself supply all of a great city's needs, but it represents a genuine hedge against the uncertainty of the imported water on which the city once leaned so heavily. San Diego also secured more senior rights to Colorado River water through agreements with agricultural users, and it has pursued conservation and recycling with vigor. What happens to San Diego as the river declines is therefore shaped by a hard-won wisdom, a recognition born of past crisis that a city must not depend too heavily on any single source. And its diversified approach stands as a model for how a coastal city can build resilience in an age of growing scarcity. Denver, the city on the river's own side of the mountains, our sixth city, is Denver, the great city of Colorado, which occupies a special place in this story because it sits in the very state where the river begins, drawing water not from the lower river's reservoirs, but from the headwaters high in the Rocky Mountains. Denver and the cities of Colorado's Front Range depend on water diverted from the upper reaches of the Colorado River system, carried through tunnels beneath the mountains to reach the populous eastern side of the state. This makes Denver dependent on the same river, but in a very different way from the desert cities downstream, drawing from the snowmelt near the river's source, rather than from the great reservoirs far below. The decline of the river affects Denver through the same underlying forces of drought and warming that reduce the snowpack in the mountains, diminishing the flow at the very source from which Denver draws. As the climate warms and the snowpack shrinks, the water available to divert to the Front Range comes under pressure, and Denver, like the cities downstream, must contend with a diminishing supply. The city has invested in conservation and in managing its water carefully, and its position near the source gives it a somewhat different set of challenges and options than the desert cities face. What happens to Denver as the river declines is a reminder that the crisis reaches all the way to the river's birthplace, that even the cities near the headwaters are not immune, and that the shrinking of the Colorado is felt from the mountains where it begins to the deserts where it ends. Denver's position also illustrates a peculiar tension at the heart of the river's management, the tension between the upper states, where the water originates, and the lower states, where much of it is consumed. The states of the upper basin, including Colorado, are obligated under the century-old framework to deliver a certain amount of water downstream to the lower basin. And this obligation shapes how much water the upper states can keep and use for themselves. As the river shrinks, meeting that downstream obligation becomes more difficult, and the upper states face the prospect of having to reduce their own use to fulfill their commitments, a pressure that reaches cities like Denver even though they sit far from the desert reservoirs. Denver draws its water from the very snowmelt that feeds the entire river, and so it is exposed to the fundamental driver of the whole crisis, the decline of the mountain snowpack under a warming climate which threatens the water at its very source. The city has been a leader in conservation among the cities of its region, encouraging efficient use and planning carefully for a drier future. And its diversified system of supplies gives it some resilience. But the underlying reality is that Denver, like every other city on this list, depends on a river that is producing less water than it once did, and its fate is bound up with the same forces of drought and warming that are shrinking the Colorado from its headwaters to its mouth. What happens to Denver is a reminder that in a river system, everyone is connected, and that the crisis at the river's end begins with the diminishing snows at its source. Albuquerque, the city that learned from its aquifer our seventh and final city, is Albuquerque, the largest city in New Mexico, which depends in part on water from the Colorado River system, brought across from the river's tributaries through a diversion project, as well as on its local river and its groundwater. Albuquerque's story is a notable one because the city once relied heavily on groundwater that it was pumping faster than it could be replenished, drawing down the aquifer beneath it in a way that could not be sustained. Confronted with this reality, the city made a determined effort to change course, turning to its share of the Colorado River system water to reduce its reliance on the overdrawn aquifer and allowing the groundwater to begin to recover. This shift has made Albuquerque more sustainable in important ways, easing the depletion of its groundwater and building a more balanced supply. But it has also tied the city more closely to the fortunes of the Colorado River system, which is itself under strain. As the river and its tributaries decline, the water Albuquerque draws from them comes under pressure, and the city must continue to balance its various sources carefully to sustain itself. What happens to Albuquerque as the river declines is shaped by this history of learning from the overuse of its aquifer and by its ongoing effort to manage a diverse but limited set of supplies. Albuquerque stands as an example of a city that has grappled seriously with the limits of its water and made real changes, and its continued challenge is a reminder that even thoughtful management must contend with the broader decline of the river systems on which the whole region depends. The transformation of Albuquerque's approach to water is one of the more encouraging stories among the seven cities, because it shows that a city can recognize an unsustainable path and change course before disaster strikes. For years, the city drew heavily on the aquifer beneath it, believing its groundwater to be far more abundant than it turned out to be, and pumping it at a rate that steadily lowered the water table and could not have continued indefinitely. When studies revealed the true limits of the groundwater, the city faced a choice between continuing on a path toward depletion or making difficult changes, and to its credit, it chose to change, developing the infrastructure to use its share of surface water from the Colorado River system and deliberately reducing its reliance on the aquifer. This allowed the groundwater to begin recovering, rebuilding the underground reserve as a buffer for the future, a remarkable reversal of the depletion that had seemed inevitable. But the shift traded one vulnerability for another, tying the city more closely to the surface water of a river system that is itself under strain from drought and warming. What happens to Albuquerque as the river declines will depend on how skillfully it can balance its restored groundwater reserve against its surface supplies, drawing on each in turn to weather the dry years, and on how deeply the decline of the river system eventually cuts into the water it can import. Albuquerque's story is ultimately one of adaptation and humility, of a city that learned the hard limits of its water and reshaped itself accordingly, and its ongoing challenge reflects the reality that in the arid West, no source is limitless, and every city must live within the bounds of what nature provides. What a city actually does when the water is cutted is worth pausing to consider what it actually means, in practical terms. For a city to face cuts to its water supply, because the phrase can sound abstract until we understand how it plays out in the daily life of a community. When a city's water supply is reduced, the response typically unfolds in stages, escalating as the shortage deepens, and these stages reveal how a modern city copes with having less water. In the earliest stages, the emphasis falls on voluntary conservation and on trimming the least essential uses, asking residents to water their lawns less, to fix leaks, to be mindful of waste, and reducing the water used for purely decorative or recreational purposes. These measures, though modest, can save a surprising amount of water, because so much urban water goes to outdoor landscaping that can be cut back without affecting the essentials of life. As shortages deepen, the measures grow more serious, moving from voluntary to mandatory, with restrictions on watering, limits on filling pools, penalties for excessive use, and requirements for greater efficiency. Cities may accelerate their programs to remove decorative grass, to install more efficient fixtures, and to recycle more of their water. In the most severe stages, the cuts begin to touch uses that matter more, and the community must confront harder choices about how to allocate its dwindling supply among competing needs, prioritizing drinking water and essential uses over less critical ones. Throughout this progression, the goal is to stretch the available water as far as possible, to preserve the essential functions of the city while shedding the uses that can be given up. And cities that have prepared, that have diversified their supplies and built a culture of conservation are able to weather deeper cuts with less pain than those that have not. Understanding this staged response helps to clarify what the decline of the river really means for the 7 cities. Not a sudden cutoff, but a progressive tightening, a gradual shift toward using less, that tests the resilience and the preparation of each community. The cities that fare best will be those that have done the work in advance, so that when the cuts come, they have room to give without sacrificing the essentials that sustain urban life. Alright, I know, second time I am bringing this up, feel free to sigh at me. But quickly, if you have made it this deep into a video about the Colorado River, you clearly find this stuff fascinating, and a lot of you who watch have not subscribed yet. That one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel like ours. No guilt, just a grateful ask. That is the last time. Promise, let's finish. The signs the crisis has already arrived at would be a mistake to think of the decline of the Colorado as a purely future threat, something that might trouble the 7 cities in years to come, because the signs that the crisis has already arrived are visible across the region for anyone who cares to look. The most famous of these signs is the Great Pale Ring that now encircles the reservoirs, the bleached band of rock along the shorelines that marks how far the water has fallen, a stark and unmistakable record of the decline that has become an icon of the whole crisis. Where boats once floated, dry ground now stretches, and marinas that sat at the water's edge have been left stranded far from the retreating shore, forced to relocate or close. The falling water has even uncovered features and objects long hidden beneath the surface, eerie revelations that have captured public attention and driven home the scale of what is being lost. Beyond the reservoirs, the signs of the crisis appear in the formal declarations of shortage that have already required the users of the river to reduce how much they take, in the cutbacks that have fallen on the farms and raised questions for the cities, and in the emergency negotiations among the states to keep the system functioning. They appear in the browning lawns and the watering restrictions of the cities, in the fallowed fields of the farms, in the rising cost of water, and in the growing public awareness that the abundance of the past can no longer be assumed. For the 7 cities, these signs are a reminder that the decline of the river is not a distant hypothetical, but a present reality, one that is already reshaping the way water is managed and used across the region. The crisis has arrived, and its early consequences are being felt, even if the most severe outcomes still lie in the future and may yet be avoided. Recognizing that the crisis is already here, written on the canyon walls and in the policies of the region, is essential to understanding the urgency of the challenge the 7 cities face and to appreciating why the work of adaptation cannot wait. The cities that treat these early signs as the warning they are and act now while there is still room to maneuver will be far better placed than those that wait until the choices grow truly desperate. For in a slow-moving crisis, the greatest danger is the temptation to assume there is always more time. The farms in the cities, one of the most important things to understand about the 7 cities and their water is that they are not the largest users of the Colorado River, because the great majority of the river's water goes not to cities at all, but to agriculture. To the vast farms that irrigate their fields with the river's water and produce an enormous share of the nation's food. This fact reshapes the whole picture of the crisis, because it means that the cities, for all their size and importance, actually consume a relatively modest portion of the river, while the farms consume the bulk of it. When we ask what happens to the cities as the river declines, we must reckon with the reality that the water is shared uneasily between urban and agricultural users, and that the balance between them is one of the central tensions of the entire crisis. This division has significant implications for how the shortage is managed and who bears its burden. Because agriculture uses so much of the water, and because much of that agricultural water holds a particular place in the priority system, the earliest and deepest cuts have often fallen on farms rather than cities, with fields left fallow and crops reduced as the river shrinks. In one sense, this protects the cities, at least for a time, because the farms absorb the initial reductions, but it also creates hardship for the agricultural communities and raises concerns about the food they produce. The relationship between the farms and the cities is thus a delicate and sometimes contentious one, as each seeks to protect its water in a time of scarcity. And as difficult questions arise about how to share the pain and whether water should shift from farms to cities as populations grow. Some cities have even arranged to acquire water from agricultural users, paying farmers to conserve or to fallow their fields so that the water can flow to urban taps, a practice that eases urban shortages but that carries its own consequences for rural communities and food production. What happens to the 7 cities cannot be understood apart from this larger contest over the river's water, in which the cities are but one set of claimants among many, and in which the vast thirst of agriculture shapes the whole landscape of the crisis. The human and economic stakes behind the abstract discussion of water levels and priorities lie the real human and economic stakes of the crisis, the ways in which the decline of the river reaches into the daily lives of the tens of millions of people who depend on it, and into the economies of the cities and regions it sustains. For ordinary residents, the most immediate effects are felt in the restrictions on water use, in the browning of lawns and the limits on outdoor watering, in the rising cost of water as supplies grow scarce and cities must invest in expensive new sources, and in the anxiety of living in a place whose water future is uncertain. These effects, while not yet catastrophic for most city dwellers, represent a real change in the quality and the security of life, a creeping awareness that the abundance once taken for granted can no longer be assumed. The economic stakes are equally significant because water is the foundation on which the economies of these cities and regions are built, and its scarcity constrains growth and raises costs across the board. Industries that depend on water, from agriculture to manufacturing to the technology sector, face greater uncertainty and expense as supplies tighten. The construction and real estate that have driven the growth of the desert cities may be constrained by concerns about whether there is enough water to support new development. The cost of securing water through new infrastructure, conservation programs, and the purchase of supplies adds to the expenses borne by cities, businesses, and households alike. And the regions most affected face the prospect of slower growth or even decline if their water cannot support their ambitions. There is also a psychological dimension to the stakes, less tangible, but no less real, in the sense of security that people feel about the place they live. To build a life, to buy a home, to start a business, or to raise a family in a city is to make a bet on that city's future, and the growing uncertainty about water can shake the confidence on which such decisions rest, when people begin to wonder whether their city will have enough water in the decades to come. It changes the way they think about their future there, and this uncertainty, spreading quietly through a population, is itself a consequence of the crisis. The human and economic stakes together make clear that the crisis of the Colorado is not merely an environmental concern, but a challenge to the prosperity and the way of life of an entire region. One that touches the pocketbooks and the daily routines of millions of people, and whose resolution will shape the future of the American West for generations. This is why the question of what happens to the seven cities matters so profoundly, because it is ultimately a question about the lives and livelihoods of the people who call them home. The solutions that could change the story. For all the seriousness of the crisis, the story of the seven cities is not one of inevitable decline, because there exists a real and growing set of solutions that could change the outcome, and the cities that embrace them may yet secure their futures even as the river shrinks. The most fundamental of these is conservation, the simple but powerful reduction of the water that cities use. And the experience of cities across the region has shown that enormous savings are possible without sacrificing the quality of life. Through the removal of thirsty decorative grass, the installation of efficient fixtures and appliances, the fixing of leaks, and the cultivation of a culture that values water, cities have managed to reduce their consumption dramatically. In some cases, even shrinking their total water use while their populations grow. Conservation is the first and often the cheapest line of defense, and its potential is far from exhausted. Beyond conservation lie other powerful strategies: the recycling and reuse of water, treating the water that flows down drains, and using it again, can multiply the value of every drop and reduce the demand on the shrinking river. The capture of stormwater, catching the rain that falls on cities and putting it to use rather than letting it run away, offers another source of supply. For coastal cities, the removal of salt from seawater provides a drought-proof, if costly, alternative: the banking of water underground. Storing it in aquifers in wet years for use in dry ones builds a buffer against shortage, and the careful management of groundwater, protecting the underground reserves from overuse, preserves a vital resource for the future. Underlying all of these is the essential work of cooperation, of the states and cities and users of the river coming together to share the shortage fairly, to keep the reservoirs from falling to catastrophic levels, and to adapt the century-old rules to the reality of a diminished river. None of these solutions is a complete answer on its own, but together they offer a genuine path toward a sustainable future, a way for the cities to live within the limits of the water the river can provide. What happens to the seven cities will depend, more than anything, on how fully and how quickly they embrace this array of solutions, and on whether the region can summon the will to act before the crisis deepens beyond easy repair. The nightmare scenario, and why it is not inevitable to understand fully what is at stake for the seven cities, it helps to look directly at the worst that could happen. The nightmare scenario that water managers work so hard to avoid, because seeing it clearly reveals both the seriousness of the crisis and the reasons it need not come to pass. The nightmare is that one of the great reservoirs falls so low that it reaches the point where water can no longer pass through the dam at all, the level sometimes called dead pool, at which the reservoir becomes a trap holding its remaining water behind the concrete with no way to release it downstream. Were this to happen, the consequences would be catastrophic, cutting off the flow of water to everyone below the dam, to the cities and farms that depend on the releases, and creating a crisis of a scale the region has never faced. It is the prospect of this scenario, however remote, that gives the falling reservoirs their urgency and that drives the desperate efforts to keep the water above the critical levels. Yet it is essential to understand that this nightmare is not inevitable, and that a great deal of effort is devoted precisely to ensuring it does not occur. The reservoirs are managed with the express aim of keeping them above the dangerous thresholds, and the agreements among the states to reduce their use are designed to slow the decline and preserve the critical levels. Wet years can bring relief, refilling the reservoirs somewhat and buying time, and every gain in conservation and efficiency helps keep the water higher. The approach of the reservoirs toward the dangerous levels has already spurred emergency actions and negotiated cutbacks that have, for now, kept the worst at bay. The nightmare scenario is thus best understood not as a prediction, but as a warning, a vivid picture of what the region is working to avoid, and the fact that it remains possible is precisely what motivates the extraordinary efforts to prevent it. What happens to the seven cities depends in large part on whether these efforts succeed, on whether the region can keep the reservoirs above the brink through cooperation and conservation, And the good news is that the outcome remains within human hands, a matter of choices still to be made rather than a fate already sealed. The warming that drives it all underneath the whole crisis of the Colorado River and the fate of the seven cities lies a force that deserves to be named directly. Because it is reshaping the very foundation of the region's water, the warming of the climate. The decline of the river is not simply the result of a passing drought, a temporary dry spell that will eventually end and restore the old abundance, but is bound up with a longer-term warming that is changing the fundamental behavior of the river and the mountains that feed it. Higher temperatures reduce the flow of the river in several ways at once, causing more of the precious mountain snow to evaporate before it can melt into the streams, drying out the soils so that they absorb more of the snowmelt before it reaches the river, and increasing the loss of water from the reservoirs and the landscape to the thirsty, warming air. The result is that even in years with reasonable snowfall, less water ultimately reaches the river than once did, a persistent erosion of the supply that operates independently of any single drought. This warming-driven decline is what makes the crisis so serious and so lasting, because it means the region cannot simply wait for the return of wetter times to solve its problems. Some scientists describe the situation not as a drought, which implies an eventual end, but as a shift toward a permanently drier climate, a fundamental reduction in the water the river can be expected to carry. If this is so, then the cities cannot count on the river recovering to its former flows, and they must plan instead for a future of lasting scarcity, adapting their expectations and their systems to a river that will carry less water than the one their growth was built upon. This is the deepest challenge facing the seven cities, the recognition that the decline they are experiencing may not be a temporary hardship to be endured, but a new and lasting reality to which they must adapt. Understanding the role of the warming climate is essential to understanding what happens to the cities, because it reveals that the crisis is not a passing storm, but a change in the climate itself, one that demands not merely patience, but transformation. What these seven cities really tell us having followed the river from the deserts of Nevada and Arizona to the coast of California. From the mountains of Colorado to the valleys of New Mexico, we can step back and see what these seven cities tell us together about the crisis of the Colorado River. The first lesson is the sheer reach of the river's influence, the way a single shrinking waterway touches so many great cities across such a vast and varied region. From those that sit beside its reservoirs to those that draw its water across mountains and deserts hundreds of miles away. The decline of the Colorado is not a local problem, but a regional one, affecting a huge population spread across many states, all bound together by their dependence on the same overtaxed river. The second lesson is that the fate of these cities is not sealed, because each of them, in its own way, has been working to confront the challenge, and their responses show that much can be done. Las Vegas has conserved and recycled with remarkable determination. Tucson has banked its water underground. San Diego has turned to the sea. Albuquerque has healed its aquifer. And all of them have pursued conservation and sought to diversify and secure their supplies. These efforts demonstrate that the decline of the river, serious as it is, need not spell doom for the cities that depend on it, provided they act with foresight and determination to live within the limits of their water. What happens to these seven cities as the Colorado runs dry will depend on the choices they make, on how well they conserve, diversify, and cooperate, and on whether the states that share the river can come together to manage its decline. The Colorado River is running dry, and the cities in its shadow face a serious reckoning. But their story is not only one of danger, but of adaptation and resilience, a test of whether the great cities of the West can learn to thrive with less water and secure their futures even as the river that made them possible continues to shrink. The third and perhaps most important lesson is that these seven cities, for all their differences, are bound together by a common fate, and that their futures will be decided not in isolation but together through the shared management of a river that belongs to them all. No city can solve the crisis alone, because the river is a single system, and the water that one city saves or takes affects the water available to the others. The reservoirs that keep the desert cities alive depend on the snows that fall near the mountain cities, and the obligations that bind the upper states shape the supply that reaches the lower ones. This interconnection means that the response to the crisis must be a collective one, a cooperation among the cities and states and users who share the river to divide the shortage fairly, to protect the reservoirs, and to adapt the rules to the new reality. The difficult negotiations that have already taken place, the agreements to reduce use and to keep the system from collapsing, are a testament to the possibility of such cooperation, and the future will depend on whether it can be sustained and deepened as the pressures grow. What happens to these 7 cities, then, is a question whose answer is still being written, in the choices they make and the cooperation they achieve, in the conservation they embrace and the sources they develop, in their willingness to live within the limits of a diminished river. The crisis is real and serious, and the decline of the Colorado is likely to continue. Driven by the relentless warming of the climate and the deep imbalance between the water promised and the water the river provides. But the story is not one of certain doom, because the cities have shown a real capacity to adapt, to conserve, to diversify, and to cooperate, and because the tools to meet the challenge exist and are being put to use. The great cities of the West rose in defiance of the desert, made possible by the water of a single remarkable river, and now they face the test of sustaining themselves as that river runs low. Whether they pass that test will depend on the wisdom and the will they bring to bear in the years ahead, and their struggle will stand as one of the defining stories of our time.